This is Pink Talks, the place where we discuss intersectionality and human rights.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for another episode in our series of Pink Talks, and specifically for sex education. So this series is one in which we are exploring questions of how can sex education be inclusive, of higher quality, and serve its purpose of informing people and how to make good choices in their sexual activities, relationships, and their sexual health. Also, we're discussing what may be going wrong with sexual education, and that most people receive today, if they receive any sex education at all. So for today's talk, we'll be discussing the LGBTQ plus inclusive sex education. My name is Leah, I'm your co-host, and I'm joined today with my colleague Femke.
Hello, good to be here again. Yes, as Leah mentioned, my name is Femke, and I'm really happy to introduce our first guest speaker for today, Mariana Brasileiro. Mariana has graduated in media studies and is currently enrolled in a master's in gender studies. She is currently living in Portugal after coming from her home country, Brazil, 5 years ago. She is a cis bisexual woman, and her interests lie in the areas of intersectional feminism, focusing on the situation of migrant women and LGBTQIA+.
And today we are also joined with Dr. Sonja Ellis. Dr. Ellis is an established researcher and professor in the field of LGBTQ plus psychology. Her research interests focus primarily on social justice issues relevant to the LGBTQ plus people, but also on gender and sexuality in adolescence. She's also a co-author of a textbook, Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, Intersex, and Queer Psychology, an Introduction, from the Cambridge University Press. And she has recently completed studies on sexuality, sexual health, and knowledge of STIs among teenagers, and is currently engaged in research projects exploring inclusion of sexuality and gender diversity in sex education. So thank you both for joining us today. Is there anything else either of you would like to add about yourselves, or maybe something that you're working on now?
For me, hi, good to be here. Thank you for having us. No, for me, actually, I think Femke resumed very well.
No, not much to add. That was a very good introduction. Just to say that I worked in the UK for about 18 years. I'm now back home in New Zealand working, and so it's been quite interesting. The LGBTIQ plus journey in both countries is both similar and different. So, and particularly in relation to this topic, it's sort of interesting as well. So, yeah.
Great. Yeah. I think we're gonna talk about that also later. So that's already a great introduction to it.
So to start off, Femke and I always find it interesting to maybe see how people get interested in sex education. So Mariana, how did you become interested in sex education?
To be honest, I think it was more of me needing to understand what it was since very young. I came from a very liberal school in Brazil. Luckily, I could understand better what it was, but still, it made me very confused about some stuff because I already knew what I was going through inside my mind and my experience. And I grew up, and then I understood more, and then I learned, and then I went through experiences, and I started realizing how in Brazil we are so far behind other places when it's about sexual education. And when I say that, I say even in the best governments that we had before the one that we have right now, that's definitely the worst. We we never had laws or any kind of decisions coming from the government to make it very clear when we should learn and what we should learn and what we should talk about and how we need to talk about. So I think it comes more of a necessity of understanding better how it works and how it's important for kids and teenagers and young adults ever. Yeah.
Great. And Sonja, can you answer the same question, maybe how you got interested in sex education?
Sure. Yeah, sure. It was partly, I guess, just happenstance. So like you said in the introduction, I've done a lot of work in the LGBTIQ plus space, and part of that was writing textbook. But one of the things that happened here in New Zealand before I came back was that the sexuality education curriculum was given an overhaul. It was made compulsory, and it was reframed and redeveloped in consultation with a lot of very good people, both who work out in community-based organisations that support LGBTIQ plus people, but also with people who had done sociological research on sexuality education in this country. So that had come out, but in reading through the guidelines for it, for my own teaching, there were a few sort of issues that were a bit problematic. And I was also quite interested to know how what was in the policy had kind of translated into a school context, given that it was very different from what had been before. And so I became interested through that and thought it would be really good to do a piece of research that spoke to the youngest people that I could feasibly ask in order to find out what they'd most recently learned in school and the extent to which that was inclusive of both gender diversity and sexuality diversity. So that's kind of how I got into that. And of course, getting into that then has led me down all sorts of other paths in related kinds of areas, as these things do. But yeah.
Great. Yeah, so today we want to specifically talk about LGBTQ inclusive sex education, and both of you mentioned already, and both of you are interested in it or have a passion for it. And we were wondering, maybe if you could give your perspective, what does LGBTQ inclusive sex education look like in practice, or how, exactly. How should it be?
Did you want to start, Mariana, or did you want me to go?
I think it's you can start.
Cool. So from my perspective as a researcher in this particular field, I think one of the things that it needs to look like is it needs to be very inclusive of diverse sexualities and diverse genders. So I think the diverse genders thing's quite clear in terms of we're meaning inclusive of non-binary gender. And increasingly in young people, we're seeing much more, many more young people identifying with non-binary gender or with diverse genders of one sort or another. In this country as well, we're not unique, but we do have Indigenous populations where non-binary genders are part of the cultural history and increasingly being reclaimed by young people from those communities as well. And so there's sort of a whole range of people around gender who want to be represented and not just having sexuality education taught in a very binary man versus woman kind of thing. But on top of that, we've got the sexual diversity, and there's two key things there. There's the sexual identity diversity, and so lesbian, gay, bisexual, or whatever other labels or not labels that people might use to define themselves. But on top of that, also a whole lot of things around sexual practices and the sort of things that people might engage in that are not just framed in a very heteronormative way. So inevitably what you get young people talking about is the way in which their sexuality education has been about sexual intercourse between a man and a woman, and everything that's talked about centres around that. And that's both problematic for LGBTIQ plus people, but also problematic for many young normatively heterosexual people as well. So a lot of young people today engage in a range of sexual practices. Some of them will be engaging in anal sexual practices. Some will be doing oral sex of one sort or another, those kind of things. And it's like there's a radio silence around anything that's kind of outside the, male to female intercourse is kind of, and an uncomfortableness about talking about it. So teachers are uncomfortable talking about sex anyway. Actually, adults are quite often uncomfortable about talking about these topics anyway. So to then have to talk about things that they perhaps are not familiar with, or that they feel uncomfortable about themselves, is then another layer of complexity on that. So to sort of answer the question about what would inclusive sex education look like, it would be inclusive of those identities and sexual diversities in terms of practices, but in a way where it's not just an add-on. So it becomes part of what's normatively talked about. So to give a good example of this, in our policy in this country, and I'm not speaking for what may or may not be going on in practice, but in the policy, the sexuality education here is now framed much more around things like consent, what good relationships look like, things around negotiating in a relationship setting around sexual practices and the use of protection, any of those kind of things, rather than being about here's the sexual practices, here's the things we can do to protect ourselves from STIs or to prevent pregnancy or those kind of things. Although those things will inevitably be in there. But it gives more scope to frame topics in ways that are not really about gender or sexuality necessarily. So if we're talking about something like consent, and what does it mean to consent to something, we can talk about that in a way that's not about a person's identity or about the kind of relationship they're in. It's, those things are kind of common across various kinds of relationships. One of the problems that comes up quite a lot, and in our most recent version that's in policy here, which came out in 2020, this has kind of been resolved a bit. But the challenge is often the way in which LGBTIQ people and topics are seen as being about identity. So when we have sexuality education, it's talked about as an identity rather than as a sexuality or as a gender. And then heterosexuality is talked about as a sexuality. So when we talk about heterosexuality in school context, it's very often about, the risk of being pregnant, that it involves intercourse, et cetera, And then when we start to talk about LGB, we start to talk about people who might not identify as heterosexual rather than people that might be in same-sex relationships, for example. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will, for me, I think inclusive sex education, as you said, and you said beautifully, I don't think I can add the way that you add, but you said something about how they don't talk about oral sex, and then they focus on penetration and then sex, like hetero sex. And then I remember how, for me, it took years to realize that sex was more than just intercourse between women and men. And thinking that now sex is just way more than this, that because when you exclude the other kinds of sex, you're going to exclude sex between women, sex between men. And for me, it's about creating safe spaces where you can talk about it for me, I created my own safe space when I grew up, and I had friends that I could talk about it in a very freely way. But when you're a kid, I think talking about that in a safe space where also professors and the teachers can speak without shame and be open to that, it's very important. Also because if they are talking, they look like they are ashamed or something, the kid is going to create that idea in their mind. So I think the safe space is so important to create the LGBT inclusive sex education. And it's so important to the mental health because it definitely changed their mind about how they see each other and themselves. So yeah, I think yeah.
I think that's a great segue, because the next question is kind of why. Why is it important to have inclusive sex education for students and also then educators too? Why is it important for all of us to have a well-rounded and inclusive sexual education?
It's quite important for a whole range of reasons, but one of the things that's very important if we're talking about sex education or sexuality education with young people, particularly in school context, is that there's a huge range of diversity among kids in school. So there will be, if we're thinking about 14, 15, 16-year-olds, we're thinking about young people who may or may not have thought about their own sexuality. They may or may not be sexually active, and some will, but some won't. It won't have even, entered on their radar particularly. I mean, they'll be aware of it, because you can't not be aware of that stuff in society nowadays, and with streaming and social media and things, it's all out there, but they possibly haven't thought about it in relation to themselves. And many won't be identifying with any label at all. And some that will be a choice. Some will not want to identify with labels, but some just won't be at that stage in their own figuring out who they are as people. So one of the things I teach here is adolescent development. And within that, one of the key things is adolescence. Young people are still figuring out who they are in all sorts of domains, and this is one of those domains. So we need to be presenting a broad, open-minded education in order to not put young people in a position where, as you said, Mariana, that it's not a safe space. And that how problematic is it that if you've already got the message at 13 or 14 that being gay is problematic in some way, and that then you get to 16 or 17 and you start to identify in that way, you recognise yourself, you've already had that negative message before you've identified, and then you're in a situation where you're having to navigate that. And so it's not helpful to young people. Plus also, I guess, another reason why it should be inclusive is that people who are normatively heterosexual also need to feel like they understand something about their friends, their peers, and the kinds of journeys that they'll be having. So, for everybody, it's a sexuality journey that you're on at that age. And we're all at different stages and all taking a different journey. So I guess those are the things that are important.
So I think one of the reasons for sure is the idea of you growing up and you don't know who you are exactly, and it's okay because it's part of the process and it's amazing. But I think the best part is to feel like it's okay for you to try to understand and take time for it. And when you don't have a place where you feel like it's okay, and they are also teaching you that. Because if you grow up, I grew up in a very heteronormative life. I had sexual education in school, a very heteronormative way. So for me, it was always like that. And I was like, okay, so that's it. That's the only right way to do. There is no other way. And then when, as you said, if you grow up and then they say to you that it's not normal, or they don't even talk about it, you're going to have to navigate through that. And it's actually unjust. It's unfair to the kids. So I think it's essential for them to understand, even the ones that are not going to recognize themselves in that, to also understand, because understanding, even if you're straight or not, it's essential. I think it's important for everyone. So yeah.
Yeah, that's quite right, Marianne. And it's about all of these things are out there, and so it's not only not just it's denial of kids' human rights to not be able to find out about these things, and by not talking about them, not being open about them, creates a thing that's problematic, which is at odds with the kind of world they're growing up in.
Yeah, for sure. It's a complicated. It's difficult to grow up, and it seems way more difficult when you don't have a place where they accept you or they're open about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what you mentioned, both of you, the not having a safe space and really like the unjust situation, or like truly like the denial of human rights, like it really has an impact, right? Like it impacts how maybe students see themselves in. We were also wondering, or wanted to talk about how sex education, or how inclusive sex education can really be vital for mental health also of sexual minority students, and or really also students or people in general, and how like these exclusive environments that we've now talked about a bit, like how can they affect the mental health of LGBTQ students in negative ways?
Yeah, it's a major factor in impacting the mental well-being of young people. So one of the things that we do know is that rates of psychological distress, depression, anxiety, and so forth are higher among this group of people. And by adding the stigma or stigmatizing things, or having a silence around those things, so that then signals a stigma as well, is really problematic. It actually exacerbates those kind of problems. It doesn't help people to be mentally healthy, to feel good about themselves, so it becomes a negative cycle that it reinforces an already difficult situation that is only made difficult not because of who people are, but because of the level of minority stress, discrimination, prejudice that they experience. And some of that comes up in school context. So if we think about sexuality education as a vehicle for a wider school context as well, that if we're problematizing things in this particular area, and then it's okay for kids in school to bully other kids on the basis of sexuality, so to call them names, or to use gay as a put down, or those sort of things, then that just adds to those issues.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say from my personal experience, I think it comes also a lot with not understanding what happens, and then you don't have like who to talk to, or you don't have how to look for it, you don't have the informations where you can find it, no one tells you, and then it comes the guilt, and then it comes the frustration, and also feeling alone in a way of, am I doing the right thing? Is this wrong? Why people don't talk about this? As I said, sex education in Brazil, it's unfortunately very behind other countries. So when we are fighting to talk about sex education in general, like even talking about LGBT sex education seems so far away from the reality that you feel like, okay, then forget about it. They are not even talking about anything. But then if they don't even mention that, maybe it's even wrong, more wrong. And then it's it gets your mind. Of course, it hurts your mental health. There is no way that it's not gonna, because you feel lost in so many ways. And if you don't have the support to make you feel like you belong and like it's okay to do that, it's not wrong, it's gonna make you feel depressed, and then make you feel alone and frustrated. And I think the guilt also comes with it, because how the people talk about sex in such a shamed way. It looks like sex comes with guilt, I also think that because there is a lot of religious included in that, which I'm not going to go there. But and then when I think about it, LGBT inclusive sex education, I think it's such an essential thing, because also it takes your mind off the idea of guilt. I don't know if I'm making myself very clear here.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think. Go ahead.
Oh, so I was just going to say that context makes a big difference. So Marianne has talked about the context in Brazil, and in a country like New Zealand, we like to think that we're quite liberal, but actually I think in many ways we're quite conservative. I think certainly in terms of sexuality, although legally, being gay is okay. We're up for the whole gender diversity debate. There's lots of very positive things happening in those spaces, but there's still in the society more widely, there are still many communities where some of those things are seen as less than okay. We've got some communities that are very strong Christian communities, particularly fundamentalist Christian communities, but also some strong Catholic communities who, often have a say in what happens in schools that are like, we've got quite a lot of schools that are Catholic schools, for example, and so although they're under the state in terms of what they're expected to teach, they can say that their community's not so happy about certain things, and they can censor some of the sexuality education content. So they can say, it's against our faith really to talk about homosexuality, and so they don't have to do it for those reasons. We also have a reasonably sized Polynesian community. And so, people from the Pacific Islands who over many generations have migrated to New Zealand have come with very strong Christian values because of the Christian missionaries that went around the Pacific and colonized all those countries. And so they come with particular views about gender diversity, but also even stronger views about bisexuality, homosexuality, all of those kind of things, which is different to my experience in the UK, which the UK is said in many ways to be quite conservative, but actually when it comes to sexuality, people are much more open to talking about it, and there seems to be fewer kind of barriers around being able to be more open about these topics.
Yeah, I think for me, it was the United States is huge, so it's very different where you come from. And I was on the East Coast in a very small, rural kind of country town. So growing up was very much abstinence was only taught, and it was very heteronormative, and you need to be safe or else you're going to get pregnant and ruin your life. And that was my sex education. And I think too, that was maybe 10 years ago, but something that always and still shocks me is I was 17 at the time, and to continue to do the not offer information to almost adults is just, crazy for me. I really hated it. It was very concerning, and I think it's still an issue today, obviously, especially I know laws have changed and some curriculum has changed too, but I know definitely in my small town, America, it's still very backwards in that sense. Yeah.
I think there's lots of parts of New Zealand that are like that. And I know I lived in Australia for a little while. In Australia, there's very much that same kind of thing that you get in the States. So there's some areas where people are much more liberal and these things are talked about more, but you don't have to go very far to find places where that's the opposite is quite true.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, so are there, in your opinions, are there other countries that may be doing inclusive sex education in a better way or a right way? And if there are, maybe what are they doing differently than these areas that aren't doing it great for their students?
Yeah, I think the two places that are doing very, very well, if I'm correct, are Norway's one, and I think it's Sweden's the other one. So, interestingly, in this part of the world, we do tend to look to Scandinavian countries as being models of really good education in a whole range of areas. I know from writing the paper, I don't know exactly what happens in schools in that part of the world, but from writing the paper, the articles that were talking about the most inclusive kind of sexuality education were ones that were being published out of those countries. And some of the things that they've done is to be teaching things in a way where they're not gendering or labeling like couples. So just talking about there's a couple and this is the situation they're in, and getting students to talk about that. So not sort of labeling them as a gay couple or as a straight couple. And also in one of those countries, but I can't remember which of them it is, they're doing a lot of integrating the sexuality education thing into other areas of the curriculum. So not treating it as something very separate, but using it as things. There's other contexts where they can talk about consent, for example, when perhaps they're doing studying a particular piece of literature or something like that. And so it's an integration of those topics, which then takes away the kind of emphasis on heteronormativity. So I'd say that's where the best examples are happening. And certainly here the policy we've got good, but I know that the practice is highly variable depending on the schools, depending on the country they're in, the communities they serve, and so forth. And we do have a lot of rural and semi-rural communities, and I don't think they're probably quite as liberal as perhaps some of our bigger cities, which are not that big, really. When I say a big city, I'm talking like our biggest city's only got 2 million people in, and the next biggest is like something like 750,000. So, they're small by European or American standards, for example.
And Mariana, would you like to expand a bit also more on your experience with like sex education in Brazil, and like how do you think it's going?
Okay, so luckily, because in Brazil, unfortunately, if you have the privilege to study in a private school, you should unfortunately enjoy it. So I had the privilege to go to a private school where luckily it was a very liberal school. So we started talking about sex education when we were around 10, 11, which is something very far from the idea that, because I also had another friends from other schools that would start talking when they were 15, 16. And of course, even if it's a liberal school, very open-minded school, it was not that open-minded about sex education. So it was very basic. The education we had, a few classes about how the boys would wake up one day and maybe the penis would be hard, and then they shouldn't be ashamed of that, and then how to put a condom in a banana. This very hetero and men focusing way of talking about sex. There was no talk about women and how girls are supposed to feel. And it also, I remember that we talk about masturbation and how it was okay for men to do it, but we never talked about how it's okay for girls to do it as well. So the women pleasure was not a topic. And I also remember that for me it was I could see the faces of the professors and the teachers, and they would be like ashamed, and the kids would laugh, and everything would be done in a very, not a good way, not the right way to deal with it. So I grew up with the idea there was only one kind of sex, and I had to grow up by myself and talk about this with my friends and look for it, and trying to understand better. I remember that I had a biology class when I was 16, 17, that I could understand finally how a woman body works, because I couldn't understand that very well. Also because I had the talk with my parents. So it was I was walking and I couldn't see anything. And then that class, I remember that was a very important class for me, because I could understand better about pleasure and about how my body works. And I also wanted to look for it more and talk to a doctor, and also, of course, in a very hetero way. So yeah, in Brazil right now, I think I was looking for it. I was researching a little bit. Always try to keep updated, because the government that we have now, and also because we are a secular state, but we're actually not. We say that we are, but we're not. So it's very complex to deal with religious and sex education at the same time. When the government says that it's not right to teach kids about sex because they will want to practice, and they're going to be motivated to have sex, it's I right now I can only imagine how the kids are, what they're learning in public education, because in private education it's easier to do that because you don't need the government authorization, but also you have the parents there sometimes that are very conservative. So I think the sex education in Brazil, as I said before, is far behind, and even thinking about including LGBT sex education, it seems so far away from a reality, which is very sad. For me, it was very hard because luckily I had friends that also they were asking themselves the same question, so we could talk about it and feel like we were not strangers or something different than the other people. But I can only imagine the kids are feeling alone and they don't have someone to talk to. So my experience was, I think most of the kids and most of the people are very hetero normative way. Maybe if I had another also education at home, but this also is very complex because it comes from generations, and so yeah.
Yeah. Femke, what about the German perspective, maybe?
So I think that so from my personal experience, it was a bit different because I always I also went to like a school that is not like public, and so it has like a different concept of teaching, but also like looking back now, I can see that in a way it was also, although it was like said to be a liberal school, it was quite conservative, especially when it comes to sex education, because I honestly don't remember having sexual education classes, which is like horrible if I think about it, because I think that I would remember if it was so either it was really bad or I really like it didn't actually happen at all, which is really crazy in a way. And I also think that it really impacted like my relation to sex, and because I like really like what you said also, Mariana, like I didn't know anything, and really like I had to learn all these things, and also in negative ways, right? Because like I wasn't really able to make informed choices, and so but I think speaking generally for Germany, I think that is also really what Sonja and Leah, you already mentioned, because the German school system is made up in a way that the different regions can also, like, they have a lot to say in the curriculum. So so it will be, it's very different for each area in Germany. So we have more conservative areas where I can imagine that sexual education there is, I mean, as we already said, super heteronormative, not really informing about pleasure and everything. I think that's something that is not happening, unfortunately. But I think there's also some areas where actually sexual education is going maybe like in the right direction, even though there's still like a lot lacking. But yeah.
I think there's probably not a country on this earth that's doing sexuality education that properly embraces pleasure, particularly for women. That's, back in the 1980s, Michelle Fine, who's an American, wrote about the missing discourse of desire in women's sex education. And 20 years later, someone wrote still a missing discourse of desire 20 years later. And I think we're probably the best part of 40 years later. And we're still talking about this being missing altogether. That, it's just one of those things that's not there. And that's kind of weird, really. And there's that thing you were saying, Finker, about the making informed choices, having the information so that you can make informed choices about these things, and to some extent normalising them. So I think about like the curriculum that we've got here runs from 5 years old, and at 5 years old, obviously they're not talking about sexuality, but they're talking about what good relating to people generally is, and it's about things like respecting one another, and it's about what's appropriate touching and what is not appropriate touching, and all of those things that are foundational to what will come later. But, it's done in an age-appropriate way that as you move through school, things are coming up. But I have a friend who's a primary school teacher. She teaches 8 and 9-year-olds, and she's recently had to do their sexuality education stuff, which is, not even quite teaching them about puberty yet. And she did a question and answer session, got the kids to put their questions into a post box. And she said some of the things that they were wanting to know were things that were like way above what, she had the authority to be teaching them. There were things you might expect someone at 13 or 14 to be asking, and they're asking at 8 or 9. And she said it's really just very difficult because you don't know whether they actually know stuff and that, you know, what they're taking from that, or whether they've just heard things and they're wanting to know a bit more about it. But, you know, as a teacher, you're in quite a tricky position because you can't just freely give out information to 8 and 9-year-olds if it's not considered generally age appropriate.
Yeah. So that's a huge issue. You mentioned it too before about like the difference now about young people getting information online, and not even, it's so, even when I was a kid, I had like a computer and things like that, but even like the phone, it's always in reach. But then you have adults or people supposed to be taking care of you, and they don't know how to deal with the situation now. And it's so conflicting that, you know, I think it causes a lot of issues. It's very difficult.
I think one of the biggest difficulties for teachers, and it applies to parents and things as well, is that in most instances the generation gap is quite huge now. It possibly won't be quite so bad going forward, but most parents and most teachers who are having to engage with this stuff actually have very limited knowledge about diverse sexualities, and gender diversity is totally off their radar. It's like, you know, so there's a big gap between their kind of personal experience and knowledge and the young people's experience and knowledge, even if that experience is just things that they've encountered in programs that they're streaming, or things they're seeing on the internet, or that their friends are sharing with them, those kinds of things. But that gap is quite wide. So I think if you ask most parents these days about what things they would tell their children or how they would have these conversations with their children, many of them would be up for having the conversations, but actually wouldn't know what to say if their child actually said, you know, what does it mean to be in a gay relationship, or that kind of thing is so far out of their realms of personal experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've mentioned this before, and in your research, Sonja, you've mentioned it too, that the policies might be present in some countries, but the implementation is still lacking. So why does this gap happen? And then also, like, how moving forward could we fix this gap or fill it?
Okay, I think there's a number of reasons why it happens. I think one is the whole discomfort around sexuality of any kind. Adults, particularly when you know that you're going to have, you know, a classroom with a load of 13, 14-year-olds or whatever age you're dealing with, and that in that class you're probably going to have some very stroppy, or, you know, some kids who will laugh or who will make fun of what's going on, either because they're immature or because they're not comfortable with it or whatever. So you've got those dynamics to deal with anyway, and then the knowledge gaps are just add to that as well, and a sense of discomfort. So even though it's you know, there might be knowledge gaps, some adults now, even though they will kind of accept or acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity out there, don't feel comfortable personally themselves around those kind of topics. So they don't feel comfortable enough to kind of talk about them with kids. So that's one thing. I think there's also sometimes parts of the policies that are problematic. So here in our policy, because schools have what they call boards of trustees, which is basically representative teachers, the head teacher or principal of the school, plus some parents as representatives of the community. Everything that's taught in the school has to be approved by the board of trustees. And if the board of trustees don't feel comfortable with it, or they think the community might not like certain things, you can get censorship happening. So that they might say, well, you know, we're happy for you to do stuff around consent, but you mustn't openly use gay examples because we don't think the parents in this area would be happy about that. Or if it's a school that's got some kind of religious background to it, so it's a Catholic school, the Board of Trustees will have representatives of the church on that board, and they might say, no, that goes against our ethos as a Catholic school. So we're not going to teach about certain things that they don't like to teach about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it can be quite tricky in that space as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the implementation in a way is also maybe due to Dash as a personal opinion that the way we still perceive LGBTQ sex education in general, and related to Sonja, what you mentioned before, which I thought it was brilliant, that you said it shouldn't be an add-on, but it actually should be the way we do sex education, because it's also also men and women don't only have penis vagina penetration, right? So and yeah, so I don't know, I would like to, if you both of you want to comment on that a bit, how we in a way can all also benefit, also hetero couples can benefit actually from LGBTQ inclusive sex education.
Well, I think one of the things that I find a little bit annoying when you're reading, like I have to do when I'm teaching about adolescence and things, reading articles that people have written that say, half of the young people when they last had sexual intercourse used a condom, but when they were having oral sex, you find the percentages are so much lower, and it's like, well, that's completely a byproduct of that, because there's this kind of thing that nobody's thinking that anybody's having oral sex. That's just not a thing. The only people they think are having anal sex are gay men, and yet we know that around 10% of allegedly heterosexual, because of course it's often just assumed that these young people are heterosexual. They've never declared that that's their identity. About 10% will have engaged in anal intercourse, either through choice or because some boyfriend has seen something on a pornographic website and decided it'd be good to try it, that kind of thing. We know that a lot of young women engage in penile oral sex because, well, a number of reasons. One, because it's you're not going to get pregnant by doing that. Often men like it. It's promoted by celebrity, so it's all over social media that's one of the things that you do. And so, it's about a repertoire. I've talked about in some of the things that I've published about repertoires of sexual behaviours, rather than kind of thinking about them as only belonging to some set of identity, that actually there's a range of things. And it's the same as in women-to-women sex, and there's often this assumption that in women-to-women sex that there's no penetrative sex, but in fact we know that many lesbians or gay women would engage in sex toy use, for example, and that's never talked about or mentioned in any of the kind of education things. Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you go to something that's more broad education, so outside of schools, you go to a website where there's lots of information about how to have safe sex, you're really hard pushed to find anything about woman-to-woman oral sex, or indeed man-to-woman oral sex, and hard pushed to find anything about sex toy use. It's just, those things are just not there, or very seldom there. And anybody could be doing those things. there is a whole repertoire of sexual activities, and you know, all young people should be able to find out information about the things that they may be engaging in or that they choose to engage in.
Yeah, I think, as you said, sex is such a huge space of possibilities, and it's not only, I think, because we grew up with the idea, of course, we're educated that way. Straight couples, they are always imagining sex in such a simple, I would say, way, when you can have so many other options and you can discover so many things together. And I think that's also LGBT sex education. As you said, even when people talk about it, they don't really talk about toys, sex toys, which is such a taboo, I believe, between heterosex, and it's such a important subject to talk about because it's a possibility there of also having fun and enjoying your body in such a different way. I also think that the heteronormative way of sex, it's we grew up with the idea that men should have pleasure but women not, and then we get to grow up and then we understand that, okay, actually also we should enjoy as well. But some couples, heteronormative couples, they don't really get to that because for various reasons. Maybe because I got to the idea when I got in touch with feminism and all of kinds of pleasures that women can take from that. And for some women, unfortunately, they don't go there. And then when what you can benefit from that is also to learn how to have to pleasure the woman, because I think also it's a subject that people don't really talk about in heteronormative couples. Women should enjoy as well, especially when we are teenagers. Like the idea is the men should enjoy, and when we are growing up, like, and the idea of sex. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Leah, do you want to continue?
Wow. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so in one of our previous talks, we mentioned how important sexual health is not only for our daily lives, but how good inclusive sex education can also intersect with other topics, such as promoting social justice. So how does sex education and, I mean, in the LGBTQ context or community, how does it intersect with social justice and those kinds of topics? How are they working together, maybe?
Well, I guess because it's to do with inclusivity and ensuring that everybody is represented, everybody is has a voice or a space, like Mariana said much earlier, about having a safe space to be, or a space where they feel safe enough to not just be themselves, but are able to inquire about things. So that works both for marginalised groups, so LGBTIQ people, but also equally for heterosexual people. So some of the heterosexual people that engaged with my survey that the paper was based on had said that, they wanted to know these things too, and it wasn't because they were going to be engaging in same-sex relationships, but they just wanted to know more, and that's a social justice thing as well. So censorship of information is not okay unless there's a good reason to be censoring it. There's some things we probably do want to censor from, say, young children. We wouldn't be wanting them to be having the same kind of conversations or engaging with the same kind of topics that we might engage with the 13, 14, 15-year-olds, for example. But to censor things so that people don't feel okay as who they are and don't feel that they can access the right information, it's not helpful. You mentioned about sort of sexual health information and things. Most of the websites that you go to, I'm in the process of doing an analysis of website content around sexual health. Most of the sites you go to, they've included some material that's much more inclusive, but then they're not consistent about how they use that. So you end up going to a page that says, in order to have safe sex, you should use a condom. And I'm thinking, okay, hello, so I'm a lesbian. How do I take that? What's that supposed to do? It's not telling me anything about my relationship or when I should use that or how I should use that. It's always assumed that it's fairly straightforward. So, of course, trying to find any information about women-to-women sex in terms of safe sex practices or what you should know, or if there's anything you should be careful about or that you should look out for, that information is one big gaping chasmless gap.
Yeah, for me, I think, as you said, I think the information is the key. To be informed is everything, always has been, and it doesn't really matter if you are straight, if you're trying to find out who you are, if you know who you are at a young age, because sometimes I think information is always an important key to, and also dialogue. So I think this comes together, and I think it's important to have the dialogue and be educated about everything that goes around our lives and society in general. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think also informed consent's very important, and we can't give consent to something, truly give consent to something, if we're not informed about it. Because otherwise, how do we know what we're consenting to? So you're actually doing a disjustice to young people by not providing the information so that they can make informed choices, whatever those choices might be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think sex education also in general really has like a history also of, so because it really it is about empowering people, about and giving them autonomy about their own bodies, right? So and I think sex education has also a history, like a negative history of denying people that autonomy, right? So yeah, and what we also said, it's really the denial of human rights. So of course, it's very much related to social justice. Yeah. So we're almost coming to an end. So we're just going to do our last question here. And that is what both of you think, how do you feel it's going? Is there, do you feel that there's a change happening with sexual education or not? And how is the change happening or not?
Did you want to go first, Mariana, or did you want me to go? I think at least in the Western world, particularly the English-speaking Western world, because I can't speak for other countries necessarily. I think yes, there is change. Things have moved quite a lot, but there's still things to be done. There's still things that need to happen. But I think we are getting there. And I think, the fact that there are, at least on paper, in a number of countries, really good things, I think is good. But I think it is highly variable. So Leah was saying earlier about the United States, where the United States is a huge country, and you've got, effectively, I forget how many states there are. Is there 52? Something like that. it's like having 52 different countries, right? So the it's a bit different there. I'm also engaged here with a number of students who are doing work in this kind of field, who come from Asian backgrounds. In Asia, it's still very much up for debate what should and shouldn't be taught, partly because of religious and cultural things. Some countries are trying to be much more liberal about it, but there's also lots of resistance. So I think, it depends where you are, and even within the Western English-speaking world, there's a lot of variation. It depends on the locations people are in, the communities they're growing up in, and what's normative in those settings. I mean, even somewhere like the UK, where I would say it's relatively liberal, attitudes towards diversity in terms of sexuality are perhaps not so well embraced in some of the more working class communities, where it's still seen as really problematic. If you're a young lad and you're gay, that's very much not okay. And actually being a lesbian is perhaps not widely embraced, but is perhaps slightly more acceptable. So even in a country like that, there is variation too.
I actually agree with you. I think it depends of where you, like, the context of the place you're talking to. When I see Europe in general, I see that, it's going forward. But when I look at Brazil, that it's the country that I come from, and I can speak with more, knowing more about it. It really depends of what moment we are going through, like the government that we have. So it's a very unstable moment right now. To be honest, I think it has been for a long time. And sex education also can be a very complicated subject, because it goes into religious and religion in general, and religious politicians are everywhere in Brazil. So it's a very complex subject in Brazil that unfortunately we're going backwards. I have hope that maybe in the next years we're going to have different results to what we are living now. But saying Brazil right now, I would say that the kids are not having sex education at all, because they can. If you come from a private school, you're gonna have it, but you are gonna have it in the most basic way. Even the more liberal schools, because there are also the relations with conservative parents and everything. And the public schools, they don't have it, because which is actually something that we have to worry about, because if you don't have sex education, and you're just not going to understand how sex works in general, what's going to happen. So kids are not going to understand where they can be touched or not, and cases of rape when they're very young are going to happen more often. So it's a very complex subject in Brazil right now. I would say that we're moving backwards, unfortunately. I do have hope. But out in Brazil, but I see in Europe in a very different situation in some countries. Like, see that the Netherlands came very they talk about sex education. They're 4 years old, and also about pleasure. As I look for a little bit about that. So I think it's very interesting to see that being talked, but very sad to see also that in some other places in the world we are going so backwards, and some other places we're going so much far. So
big discrepancies, unfortunately. All right, Sonja, Mariana, thank you so much we are at the end of our talk, and we just want to thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you, and for your great insights, and for sharing your time also. And we're always so happy to talk about this. It's so important, like extremely important topic, and thank you. Also, Leah, thank you so much for co-hosting again. And is there anything you would like to say for the end?
No, just thank you both for joining and giving your time, and for speaking with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much, and take care, everyone, and see you soon.
See you. Be safe.
Thank you for listening to Pink Talks. Before we go, show some love for our favorite podcast by leaving us a comment and subscribe to the channel. We are Young Educators, a non-profit organization working on human rights, gender equality, and active citizenship. And this podcast was created with the support of our team: Ana Catarina Caldeira,
Laura Staffia,
Emke Becherer,
Leah Cheney,